Thank you. Now, my dear friends, we'll start with a verse from the Acts of the Apostles. It's in chapter 16 and verse 25. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake. On it goes to tell how they were miraculously delivered by the earthquake, which allowed them to be free from their shackles. But I would want to zoom into this one phrase, that they were singing hymns at midnight, for this is the theme of this conference, singing hymns to our God. Now, the word hymn is, in English, derived from the Latin hymnos, which itself comes from the Greek hymnos, and that itself is derived from the word for to sing, ordain. So it's pre-Christian. In ancient pagan literature, hymnos designates a prize song to the gods or heroes, set to the accompaniment of the chitara. Now we have this ancient quote which distinguishes between what is addressed to God and what is addressed to man in praise. Hymnoi, hymns, men, that's Greek for on the one hand, es tus theus poiunte, they make unto gods. Okay, so that's hymns. Epainoi, they en anthropis, or es anthropus. So epainoi are praises. Praises, on the other hand, are what they do for men. So we have hymns to gods and praises unto men. That's already pre-Christian as a distinction. In ancient times, we have a very ornate measure used for these praises of the gods. For instance, the oldest that we seem to have is the hymn to the Delphic Apollo. Very complex in its meter, but indicating that they're trying to use the best they have to honor the gods. Okay, we don't come from the moon, we come into something which is pre-existent. We take on bits of culture. What happens? In Christian literature, the noun hymnos occurs actually in only 2 passages in the New Testament. It's in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19, and Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. And then, together with the synonyms psalmos, psalm, and ode pneumatike, that is spiritual song. Our word ode is from ode in Greek. So these two happen together, singing psalms and spiritual songs. So these are used in St. Paul's exhortation. These are the language that Christians should be having, and not foul language, buffoonery, and things which are unworthy of a Christian soul. He wants them elevated and therefore to be in a praiseworthy mode. We do, however, have the use of the word to sing a hymn, that is humnein in Greek. So we have in the account of the Last Supper, both in Matthew and in Mark, the expression having sung a hymn. That's actually one word in Greek. It's the aorist of hymno. And we also have In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 12, it's actually a quote from the Old Testament. I will sing praises to thee among the nations, that kind of thing. Well, it's basically using the form of hymnal to sing a hymn. And then we have what I just quoted at the beginning, what happens there in the Acts of the Apostles. Okay, so what's going on? What would they have sung at the Last Supper? Well, the exegetes tell us that what was happening there was that precisely the pre-existing backdrop was not taken away. It was the Pesach, and it was therefore this element of the obligation to sing certain things at that. And therefore it was the great Hallel, which is a series of psalms praising God. Hallelujah. Hallel comes from just praising God for his mirabilia, for his wonders. And so the salvation history is set before the people, because remember, they were remembering the victory which happened over the powers of Pharaoh, which got the holy people out of slavery and eventually to the promised land. So it is the foreshadowing of our own victory, the exodus of Christ from Jerusalem, but on Calvary, and therefore winning for us entrance into the true promised land. So, what happens? They are using the hymn book of Israel in the early stages, the Psalms. The Latin word hymnus is unknown in the pre-Christian literature. For it, the word carmen is used. Carmen is song, as you probably know. And so we have, with time, a new genre coming into existence. It's Christian hymnology. We have the definition of St. Augustine. Listen carefully, it contains 3 elements, and all 3 have to be there for it to be truly a hymn. The most famous definition precisely is the one we have here in this phrase of St. Augustine, so let's kind of memorize it. He's actually commenting the psalm, the last but 2 in the Psalter, 148. And he asks, because he always asks questions, doesn't he, when he's writing and preaching, "Know ye what a hymn is? It is a song with praise of God. Cantus est cum laude Dei." Now, got those 3 elements? Because he expands then and argues this: if thou praisest God and singest not, thou utterest no hymn. If thou singest and praisest not God, but another thing, thou utterest no hymn. A hymn, then, containeth these 3 things: song, cantus, and praise, cum laude, and that praise of God, Dei. He does, however, make a little, as it were, addendum to this by questioning, can we praise saints? And he bases it precisely on the fact that the psalm itself talks about hymnus omnibus sanctis eius in verse 14, the hymn to all his saints, or the praise of all his saints. He is the praise of all his saints. Now, His argument is this: the expression praise of God must not, however, be taken so literally as to exclude the praise of his saints. St. Augustine himself says in the explanation of the same psalm, verse 14, Hymnus omnibus sancti seus, what then meaneth this? A hymn to all his saints? Let his saints be offered a hymn. God is really praised in his saints and in all his works, and therefore a praise of the saints is also a praise of God. Now, what's going to happen with history? In practice, it is a slow process of organic growth. Essentially, what happens is this: because Christians are being born into a culture, those who are erudite within the culture will respect the canons and norms of the poetry of the culture. Hence, there are, in the early centuries, these itches around to take on the rules of classical poetry. However, what happens essentially is this: prompted no doubt by the Spirit of God, those competent in the matter realize that some pieces of poetic praise take off more easily than others. They are those that correspond to the natural rhythm of the voice. And so, what happens is that a certain type of praise in poetry becomes easily diffused within the Christian world. They're not those that are most complex, but those that have a natural rhythm and therefore are easily sung. The development of hymnody is different in the East. They have their own great figures, as early as St. Ephraim, for instance, the Syrian. But in the West, which is what concerns us, it has its own development, which has gone on to our day. A great figure is the Bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose. And we know from the Confessions of St. Augustine how the power of melody coupled with word had an effect on the soul of this man who was still on the brink. He was moved to tears. St. Ambrose wrote 4-liners, and they had such a success that they found their way very quickly into the liturgy of the church and are still there to this day, even on a weekly basis. And so we are linked with our brethren of the early church through these hymns that we still sing either in the original Latin or in translation. There is the fact that one thing which happened unexpectedly in the development of Christian hymnody was the fact that there had to be an immediate reaction to something that was happening. Listen to this. The earliest safe historical data we find, in endeavouring to trace the origin, belong to the 4th century. The writing of Christian hymns intended to be sung in Christian congregations was first undertaken to counteract the activity of the heretics. The Gnostics, one in particular, Bardesanes, and his son Harmonius, had incorporated their erroneous doctrine in beautiful hymns. And, as St. Ephraim, he was a deacon there in the Syrian church, says, clothed the pest of depravation in the garment of musical beauty. As these hymns became very popular, an antidote was needed. This induced St. Ephraim, who died in 373, to write Syrian hymns. His success inspired St. Gregory of Nazianzus. He died the following year. No, in 389, a little bit later. To counteract the heresy of the Arians by Greek hymns. About the same time, St. Ambrose, he died in 397, composed Latin hymns, although the productions of his forerunner in Latin hymnody, St. Hilary of Poitiers, who had died in 366, had been unsuccessful because they failed to please the popular taste. Now, do we see here how already the test of time comes in? What actually passes? That test will survive. And one big element in this is the popular appeal. Thus, the earliest known founders of hymnody in the East and West appear at the same period. So, I'll leave it there for a few seconds and then go into more detail on one or two things which will lead us up bit by bit to where we stand now. This is just, if you like, the groundwork to see where we're coming from in the earliest period. Back in a minute. Now, we notice that there is a clean break with the ancient straitjacket, which was the obligation of ancient poetry, based on long and short syllables, technically so, and placed in the correct order in the line for that to obey the rules, therefore very difficult. The Christian poets could have gone in that line because they were very much aware, but it didn't happen so. Listen to this. The quantitative principle, that's what I'm talking about here, was gradually abandoned by hymn writers in favour of the rhythmical. Christians were the first to break away from the learned game of long and short syllables intended for the eye alone, for they wished to reach the ear of the masses. These early Christians strove for and attained by means of the metrical system of their ecclesiastical poetry that which, in German religious poetry, was first achieved by Luther. Contact with the people, with their ear, and thus with their heart. We forget that Luther actually composed himself Ein feste Burg was composed by him, music and melody. The further development of this rhythmical poetical form, especially in Latin, is thus something which leads to what we have right now in our time. But it passes through great giants. We have people who are of the same league as the great poets of antiquity, but are Christian. And they bring on their baggage with them, a baggage which has enriched our praise to this day. A great poet would be Venantius Fortunatus. His dates are 530 to 609. So he is living at the same time as Sir Gregory the Great, whose name gives us the word Gregorian chant. But this is based not on Gregorian chant, but on the Roman cadence. It's almost the military cadence, where a Gregorian chant is based on the concept of a word elongated and going up and down. The hymns are based on the marching army more. So listen to this. It's the hymn which is sung in Passiontide at Vespers, still to this day, whether in Latin or in English, and is very moving. And it proclaims the triumph of the cross. We can see Christ going to his victory with this glorious cross. Vexilla regis prodeunt, the banners of the king go forth. You probably know it slightly from having heard it on various tapes or whatever, but it's still used a lot. Vexilla regis prodeunt, fulget crucis mysterium, quo carne carnis conditor, suspensus est patibulo. Which comes into English in our present breviary here very well. Abroad the regal banners fly, now shines the cross's mystery. Upon it life did death endure, and yet by death did life procure. And on it goes. In that same period of Passiontide, we are exposed also to the great hymns of the Passion, which go back to the great Latin hymn writers. We have, at the same period, and at Corpus Christi, echoes of St. Thomas Aquinas, especially at Corpus Christi, when the whole theology of the Last Supper and the Real Presence are put in verse form. They're gems, perfectly rich. And we have also in there these developments which are called sequences. And in the sequence, Lauda Sion Salvatorem, we have all the theology of the Real Presence in verse form. It's amazing, and it's perfectly rhymed and reasoned, rhythmic and good poetry, as well as perfect theology. He was a giant. Indeed, the story is told that when it came to the institution of Corpus Christi, the Pope called the two great theologians of the time, St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas, to him, having asked them to compose, both of them, an office, that is all the offices, for this new feast. And according to the story, it was St. Thomas who was asked to proclaim first what he had composed, and as St. Bonaventure beside him listened, he was so deeply moved that he tore up all that he had written behind his back. The manuscript was all torn to shreds, and no one ever knew what he wrote, even though we know from his other writings that he was very able to compose and was a great writer himself. So we still sing to this day all that St. Thomas composed for that. In fact, when we have benediction, we're singing parts of what he wrote there, Tantum Ergo, it's part of his work, and all those prayers are still his. And so there we are, how things which stand the test of time survive and are still used on a regular basis. But then we have the regular hymns, not just those of the seasons, but those hymns who have stood the test of time and therefore are easily available and easily singable. And it makes a huge difference when we choose to sing them rather than say them. It's not difficult. Once the melody has been learned, it's been learned forever. And the advantage of these melodies are that they are easily pickable, upable. They're not complex. And they also can be memorized. And many offices can be sung partly in the dark. I remember my father, when he visited me in the monastery years ago in France, he came to the midnight office and he was deeply moved to see how a great chunk of Lauds, that's not Matins but the office that follows it, was sung in complete darkness. For instance, the Miserere was known from memory, and the three Laudate psalms at the end were known from memory, and the Benedictus was known from memory. And so out went the lights, and Dad was moved by this chant echoing from the heart of the Middle Ages in the language of the centuries. And so too, we can learn the whole of Compline if we want to by heart and sing it just by candlelight. But anyway, it is very moving to sing the song of the centuries. For instance, even in English, it works perfectly well. The chant of the dawn of Sunday. It comes directly from the Latin, and the melody is tranquil. Transcendent God in whom we live, the resurrection and the light, we sing for you a morning hymn to end the silence of the night. Creator, and so on it goes. These things make a big difference, and go back to the point that I made in the beginning, that St. Augustine does insist that if we don't actually sing, we're not actually in this mode of hymnology. It's a said prayer, and that same author does indicate that he who sings prays twice. And so this is part of our heritage. The notion of singing is still there always in the East. Unfortunately, we've lost it partly in the West through the fact that we had very early on in time the possibility of having the said Mass. And so we lost it, whereas in fact we've recuperated it if we want to since the explosion of the Second Vatican Council, which deliberately opened the door to putting in singing even on the non-solemn celebration of the sacred mysteries. The invitation is there in the early documents coming from the Council to make use of song. And that is done in other countries more than Ireland, but the notion of the absolute separation between the two has gone, and that's for the better. We need, therefore, to bring in the use of this other dimension, which ennobles completely our worship. Now, I did touch on the fact that it had been perceived, both by those reacting against the Gnostics, and then in Germany, that the power of praise, and therefore good poetry, put to music, had been picked up for what it was, a vehicle of getting a message across. It works. It has always worked. In the 1700s, there was a great explosion in hymnology in the British Isles. It was in the wake of the Methodist revival. Initially, it was within the Anglican communion itself, remembering that there were clergy involved. But then, eventually, it broke the barriers and became a movement of its own and formed its own denomination, still there to this day. But it did have, in England, great representatives in this field, and also in Wales. The great name in England was Charles Wesley, and the great name in Wales at the same period was William Williams of Pantycelyn, who wrote about 1,000 hymns, and Charles Wesley was hot on his heels. And in the two contexts, they had the success they had because they had an appeal. The music used was easily memorizable, and the harmony that it invited gave a great gusto to their use. This was even more pronounced in Wales than in England because of the nature of that nation. And so they had a huge effect in creating beauty. When the people got together to praise, they instinctively went into a four-part harmony, and this new plethora of hymns being written year by year was a great asset to both the culture and the literature of the period, and is still there to this day, used greatly. And the interesting thing is to note how biblical and how theological each word is. It's carefully chiseled, and it's aiming at what is understood to be correct theological writing. It usually is within, actually, the parameters in which they're working, and they're fairly keen on maintaining that. And it has also value, both on the aesthetic level and on the level of the doctrine contained, because it is actually scriptural, based on the victory of the Lamb and so on. They're neutral concepts which can therefore be taken on, and they are taken on by ourselves when we use the best of what is coming out of there. Many of our great hymns have come from that period. And also we have a certain cross-fertilization with other countries, notably Germany. Some of the great German ones have come over into English, and we still use them without realizing it. In other words, again we see the test of time. What works will work. Now I want to go into one or two things on this level in a minute to place before our eyes what is truly worthy and what is not, because we are handling something which is not without, if you like, a divine intervention as well. Man and God are working hand in hand when it comes to creating beauty, authentic beauty. It cannot be otherwise, and therefore we need to be aware of the responsibility that we have, both with regard to culture and with regard to praise, when we are handling creation in this realm of hymnology. So I'll come back to one specific area just to conclude in a minute. Those of us who remember the period of harnessing hymns in the years following the council will remember how there was in the air already a certain repertoire there for the taking, and they're still there. Notably Marian hymns, Eucharistic hymns, things like Soul of My Saviour, Sweet Sacrament Divine, and so on, we will still know and be able to sing very well. And they were already there before the council itself in popular devotion, and they could be sung sometimes in the context of the Low Mass, because there was, even before the Second Vatican Council, the possibility of using English hymns at the Low Mass, not the High one. Everything in the High one had to be in Latin. So there was that interim period when therefore these hymns were already there and they were being used. And then eventually what happened? There was a movement to create new hymns, and this then is the problem, because at that point, if one looks carefully at what actually happened, in a fairly short time, those that were well known yielded their place to new compositions which were not of the same kind. Some were picked up by the congregations and were sung, but quite a few of them were not. They were sung by a choir or a small band of maybe folk singers. It wasn't quite the same. And so actually we lost something at that point. However, not all, because we still have in our books the old as well as the new. The only thing is that we tend, if we're honest, to neglect actually that which is best because of the depth and profundity which is in them. There's one example which comes immediately to mind. It's the very oriental hymn that we have based on the Liturgy of St. James. And it's very moving, actually. It's very suitable at Holy Communion or even at the entry. If one is using incense, for instance, it's very suggestive. And the words are very powerful. It's in our books still and can be used. Let all mortal flesh keep silence, and with fear and trembling stand. Ponder nothing earthly minded, for with blessing in his hand, Christ our God to earth descendeth, our full homage to demand. And on it goes talking about the angelic choirs, and it's very moving and very oriental. But then, in the same books, one will come across, very close to them, on the same page perhaps, other things which are of a different order. This happened to jump out of the page today. Rise and shine, and give God his glory, glory, children of the Lord. The Lord said to Noah, there's going to be a floody. Lord said to Noah, there's going to be a floody. Get those children out of the muddy, children of the Lord. And on it goes for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 verses. And then you've got this rise and shine and give God his glory, glory, children of the Lord coming in between each one. Now, question, is that of the same order as what we just sang a few seconds ago? I would tentatively say perhaps not. And yet it's in the same book with ecclesiastical approval. So we're allowed to use these things in church, and others which can be composed still, because they're not yet officially recognized, may not perhaps be used, because officially these have to have approval before they enter into the liturgy. But what's gone on there? Well, several things have gone on. And unfortunately another thing has gone on, which is still going on. It's the fact that people have got this obligation now to put in the hymn books that we use language which is in no way offensive. That means that dirty words like men must not figure in it at all. And so everything which is in any way gendered has to be castrated and duly pruned, chiselled, readapted and remodelled to make it politically correct. So what's happened? You've got great poets in their grave, turning over and groaning, what have they done to me without my permission? I have copyright over this, and no one asked me. Ah! And yet, it's all correct. It's actually a severe injustice. One has no right to fiddle with the poet's intuition and wording, just as one has no right to fiddle with an architect's vision and chiselling, because he knew what he wanted when he created a church. It's wrong to think that we can get it better. The lines of vision are meant to be what they are, and they have a focal point. Mess with the focal point and it all goes awry. So too, the poet knows what he wanted, and he doesn't like, even in the grave, to see his things being messed up by people who are amateurs and don't know what they're doing. So, what have we? In practice, in the space of one generation, we have gone from something which was, yes, worthy, noble, and done by experts, to something which, as well as that, is admitted because it is with it, but also shoddy, shabby, amateur, base, unworthy of the Lord and even of man, and yet it's with it, it's cool, and it seems to attract the young. Oh, we have noticed, actually, both in our monastery in Italy, where we had a lot of Latin and incense and ancient beauty, the young were quite fascinated. And also in Navan there, in Johnstown, where I have the Latin Mass on a Sunday, the full High Mass there, that actually the young people come. It's amazing, but they're not at all switched off. They are in some way amazed at what we have lost. A child actually somehow intuits this is kind of extra special, and they do like the fascination of the other. We have impoverished our own experience in trying to be user-friendly. Are we perhaps not user-friendly, but demon-friendly in playing to the gallery and throwing overboard what centuries and centuries of organic growth under the guidance of the Spirit calmly put together? Unfortunately, we're living still in the dismantling generation. We'll need one more generation yet before we realize it's time to get back to something which is high and noble and not just a quick fix. August and glorious, wonder unseen, yet heard through Christendom from age to age. Could ere thy quill have known what shapes would mean, what strength of voice it left upon the page. O hidden face untraced by any man, we gaze upon thee through the memory of characters that hold what thinking can pass through the veins of copied history. O wielder of the pen that moved the world, O little hand that thought the thoughts of old, teach us to feel the moving of a word, to hear the echo of a sound so small. For thou didst write, and in the height of thought didst pause to cause a tremor that would stir the heart of oft a traveller here caught, where waves of a moving meaning yet occur. And from the grave of long antiquity, thy silent hand yet steers our wayward limbs, and there is in a sound eternity. For thou hast traced a glory no age dim,